Dante Moretti was not asleep. His eyes were closed, his breathing heavy and rhythmic, and his frail body was slumped deep into the worn leather of his favorite armchair. To anyone watching, he looked like a tired, harmless old man drifting into an afternoon nap. But beneath his eyelids, Dante was wide awake. His mind was sharp, calculating, and waiting. This was a game Dante had played many times before. He was 68 years old, and he was one of the wealthiest men in Venice. He owned shipping companies that transported goods across 3 continents, luxury hotels that dotted the Amalfi Coast, and investment portfolios that would make even the greediest banker weep with envy. He had everything a man could dream of, except for one thing: trust. Over the years, Dante had become bitter. His 2 children, Marco and Giulia, rarely visited him anymore. When they did appear at his door, they only talked about money, asking for new cars, vacation homes, or advances on their inheritance. His business associates smiled at him during meetings, but he knew they sharpened their knives behind his back, waiting for him to show weakness so they could devour his empire. Even his previous household staff had stolen from him. Silver candlesticks, cash from his office safe, bottles of aged wine from the cellar. Dante had grown to believe that every human being on Earth was fundamentally greedy. He believed that if you gave a person a chance to take something without getting caught, they would take it every single time. Today, he was going to test that theory again. Outside the tall windows of his study, the rain was pouring down in thick sheets, hammering against the glass like 1,000 tiny fists. The sky over Venice was dark and heavy, turning the afternoon into something closer to twilight. Inside, the study was warm and dimly lit. A small fire crackled in the marble fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the walls lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The air smelled faintly of old leather, wood smoke, and the damp mustiness that came with living so close to the canals. Dante had set the stage perfectly. On the massive mahogany desk positioned directly in front of him, just within arm's reach, he had placed 10,000 euros in cash. The bills were crisp and new, arranged in neat stacks that he had then deliberately disturbed to make them look careless. Several bills hung off the edge of the desk, as if they might tumble to the floor at any moment. The money was real. The trap was real. Dante had left the tall window behind the desk open just a crack, allowing a cool breeze to drift into the room. The breeze was strong enough to occasionally lift the corners of the exposed bills, making them flutter and shift. It looked like the money might blow away entirely if left unattended. It was the perfect image of an absent-minded old man who had forgotten his cash and drifted off to sleep without securing it. But there was more to the test than just money. Scattered across the floor near Dante's feet were 5 prescription bottles. They were various sizes and colors, their labels facing different directions, lying haphazardly as if they had been knocked over by accident. In truth, Dante had placed them there himself, carefully arranging them to look random. The bottles contained his actual medications. Heart medication, blood thinners, blood pressure pills. They were essential to keeping him alive. The labels bore warnings printed in bold red letters. Take at prescribed times. Do not skip doses. Mixing doses may cause cardiac arrest. To anyone who knew anything about managing serious illness, these bottles scattered on the floor would look dangerous. Negligent. Like an old man who could no longer take care of himself. Dante shifted slightly in his chair, keeping his breathing steady and deep. He had positioned himself at just the right angle. From where he sat, with his head tilted back against the leather cushion, he could see through the tiniest slit between his eyelashes. His view was narrow but sufficient. He could see the desk. He could see the money. He could see the door. He waited. The brass door handle turned with a soft metallic click. The heavy oak door swung open slowly, revealing a young woman dressed in a simple gray cleaning uniform. Her name was Alessia Cavalli. She was 32 years old, though her face looked older. There were deep shadows under her eyes, the kind that told a story of sleepless nights and relentless worry. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her hands, though clean, were rough and red from years of scrubbing floors and washing dishes. Alessia had only been working at the Moretti estate for 2 weeks. Dante knew almost everything about her. He had conducted a thorough background check before hiring her, as he did with all his staff. Alessia was a widow. Her husband, a factory worker named Antonio, had died in a workplace accident 3 years ago. The company had paid a small settlement, barely enough to cover the funeral costs. Since then, Alessia had been working 3 jobs just to keep a roof over her head and food on the table for her son. Today was a Tuesday, and normally Alessia worked alone in the mansion while Dante retreated to his study. But today was different. Behind Alessia, moving with hesitant, careful steps, was a small boy. He looked to be about 9 years old. He was thin, almost fragile, with messy dark hair that fell into his eyes. His clothes were clean but worn, the kind of hand-me-downs that had been mended too many times. His shoes were scuffed at the toes, and the laces were knotted in places where they had broken and been tied back together. This was Matteo, Alessia's son. Dante had not given Alessia permission to bring the boy to work. In fact, his employment contract explicitly forbade it. But Alessia had begged the head housekeeper, Signora Fabri, for a special exception this one time. The schools were closed today. Some kind of emergency maintenance issue involving flooding in the building. Alessia had no money for a babysitter, and she had no family nearby to help. She had pleaded with Signora Fabri, promising that Matteo would be silent, invisible, no trouble at all. Signora Fabri, a stern woman with little patience for excuses, had reluctantly agreed, but warned Alessia that if Signore Moretti discovered the child, both of them would be dismissed immediately and without pay. Dante had heard the entire conversation from his study. The walls in the old mansion were thick, but sound traveled through the heating vents. He had listened to Alessia's desperate voice, the shame and fear in every word. He had decided not to intervene. Not yet. He wanted to see what would happen. He wanted to see what kind of person this boy really was. Alessia stepped into the study and immediately froze when she saw Dante slumped in his chair. Her hand flew to her chest, and she held her breath, terrified that she had disturbed him. Matteo stood close behind her, partially hidden by her body, his eyes wide with fear. Alessia turned and crouched down so she was at eye level with her son. She gripped his small shoulders tightly, her fingers pressing into the thin fabric of his jacket. Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling with urgency. "Stay here, Matteo. Sit in that corner by the bookshelf. Do not move. Do not touch anything. Do not make a single sound. Do you understand me?" Matteo nodded quickly, his eyes never leaving the sleeping figure in the chair. "Yes, Mama," he whispered back. "The Signore is sleeping," Alessia continued, her voice breaking slightly. "If you wake him, if you disturb him in any way, Mommy will lose this job. We will not have money for rent. We will not have money for food. We will have nowhere to go. Do you understand how important this is?" Matteo's lower lip trembled, but he nodded again. "I understand, Mama. I will be good. I promise." Alessia's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly. She kissed the top of Matteo's head, then guided him gently to the corner of the room where a faded Persian rug lay beneath a tall shelf of old law books. Matteo sat down on the rug, pulled his knees to his chest, and wrapped his thin arms around them. He looked like a small statue, barely breathing. Alessia stood and glanced nervously at Dante. His chest rose and fell in steady rhythm. His mouth was slightly open, and a faint snore escaped his lips. It was a performance Dante had perfected over the years. Alessia seemed satisfied that he was truly asleep. She turned and walked softly toward the door, her footsteps almost silent on the thick rug. Before leaving, she looked back one more time at her son. Matteo had not moved. He sat perfectly still, his dark eyes locked on the floor. Alessia mouthed the words, "I love you," then slipped out of the room and closed the door behind her with the softest click. Silence fell over the study like a heavy blanket. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire, the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, and the rain drumming against the windows. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Dante kept his breathing slow and even, but his mind was racing. He could feel the boy's presence in the room, a small bundle of nervous energy huddled in the corner. Through the narrow slit of his eyelids, Dante studied the child. Matteo had not moved since his mother left. He sat completely still, his arms wrapped around his knees, his chin resting on top of them. He looked terrified. Dante had expected something different. He had expected the boy to be curious, restless. Children were naturally drawn to things they were told not to touch. He had expected the boy to stand up, wander around the room, pick up expensive objects, maybe even reach for the money. That was what children did, especially poor children who had never seen so much cash in one place. But Matteo did not move. 1 minute passed. Then 2. Then 5. Dante's neck was beginning to cramp from holding his head in the same position for so long, but he did not break character. He remained perfectly still, breathing deeply, waiting for the boy to make his move. The fire popped loudly, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney. Matteo flinched at the sound but did not stand. The clock continued its steady rhythm. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Dante began to wonder if the boy would do anything at all. Perhaps the child was simply too frightened to move. Perhaps his mother's warning had been enough to paralyze him completely. Dante felt a flicker of something unexpected. Disappointment? No, that was not quite right. It was something else. Something he did not want to name. Then, finally, there was movement. Dante heard the soft rustling of fabric. The boy was standing up. Dante tensed every muscle in his body, preparing himself. Here we go, he thought. The little thief is making his move. He heard the soft padding of small footsteps crossing the rug. The boy was approaching the desk. The footsteps were slow, hesitant, as if Matteo were afraid the floor might creak and give him away. Dante visualized the scene in his mind. The boy would see the money. His eyes would go wide. He would glance back at the sleeping old man to make sure it was safe. Then he would reach out, grab a few bills, maybe a whole stack, and shove them into his pockets. It would be fast. Quiet. The boy would return to his corner, and no one would ever know. Except Dante would know. He would open his eyes, catch the boy red-handed, and prove once again that every human being, no matter how young or innocent they appeared, was fundamentally corrupt. The footsteps stopped. The boy was standing right beside the desk now, mere inches from the money. Dante waited for the sound of paper rustling, the sound of small hands grabbing at the bills. But that sound did not come. Instead, Dante heard something different. A soft gasp. Then the boy's voice, barely louder than a breath. The wind. There was a rustling sound, but it was not the sound of money being taken. It was the sound of money being gathered. Dante's eyes opened just a fraction wider, breaking his performance for the first time. Through the tiny gap in his eyelashes, he could see the boy's small hands moving across the desk. Matteo was not grabbing the money for himself. He was gathering the loose bills that had been scattered by the breeze from the open window. The boy's movements were careful, almost reverent. He picked up each bill gently, smoothing out the ones that had been folded by the wind. He stacked them neatly, aligning the edges with precision. When he had gathered all the loose bills, he looked around the desk as if searching for something. His eyes landed on a smooth marble paperweight shaped like a lion's head. Matteo picked up the paperweight and placed it on top of the stack of money, weighing it down so the breeze could no longer disturb it. Then he stepped back and examined his work, nodding to himself as if satisfied. Dante's mind went blank. He could not process what he was seeing. This was not part of the script. This was not how the test was supposed to go. The boy was not stealing. He was protecting. Matteo turned slightly, and his gaze dropped to the floor near Dante's feet. His eyes widened when he saw the prescription bottles scattered across the Persian rug. Oh no, the boy whispered to himself. These fell. Matteo knelt down on the floor, his small frame folding in half as he carefully picked up the first bottle. He held it gently in both hands and turned it so he could read the label. His lips moved silently as he sounded out the words. Morning dose. 8 in the morning. He set the bottle down on the edge of the desk and picked up the second one. Afternoon dose. 12 noon. One by one, Matteo retrieved all 5 bottles from the floor. He read each label carefully, squinting at the small print in the dim light from the fire. When he had collected all of them, he stood and looked at the desk. There was a clear space near the lamp, away from the money. Matteo placed the bottles there, arranging them in a precise line from left to right. 8 in the morning. 12 noon. 4 in the afternoon. 8 at night. Before bed. The bottles stood like little soldiers, perfectly aligned, their labels all facing forward. Dante could see the boy's concentration, the seriousness on his young face. This was not a game to him. This was important. Then Matteo did something that made Dante's heart stop. The boy reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out a small, faded photograph. The edges were bent and frayed, as if it had been handled thousands of times. The photograph showed a much younger Matteo, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, sitting on the lap of an elderly woman. The woman had white hair and a warm smile. She was holding Matteo tightly, and both of them were laughing at something outside the frame. Matteo looked at the photograph for a long moment, his expression soft and sad. Then he placed it gently on the desk, right beside the row of medicine bottles. He adjusted it carefully so that the photograph was standing upright, leaning against the base of the lamp. The old woman in the picture now seemed to be looking directly at the pills. Matteo stepped back and folded his hands in front of him. He spoke softly, as if he were talking to someone who might actually be listening. "This is my Nana Lucia," he whispered. "She had heart medicine too, just like these. She told me you have to take them at the right times, exactly when the bottle says. If you mix them up or forget them, your heart can stop beating. She said it is very serious." Matteo adjusted the photograph one more time, making sure it was perfectly straight. "She was very good at remembering," he continued. "She never forgot. Not even once. So I am leaving her picture here so she can watch over you and remind you. She is very kind. She will make sure you stay safe." The boy's voice cracked slightly on the last word. He stood there for a moment longer, staring at the photograph of his grandmother. Then he wiped his eyes quickly with the back of his hand, turned, and walked back to his corner. He sat down on the rug, pulled his knees to his chest again, and wrapped his arms around them. He did not look at the money. He did not look at the old man in the chair. He simply sat there, silent and still, as if nothing had happened. Dante could not move. He could not think. His entire body felt frozen, as if the air in the room had turned to ice and trapped him in place. His mind was screaming at him, demanding that he make sense of what he had just witnessed. This boy, this child who had every reason to steal, who had been labeled a thief by the world, who lived in poverty and desperation, had not taken a single euro. He had not even looked at the money with greed or longing. Instead, he had protected it from the wind. He had gathered Dante's scattered medications and arranged them with care. He had left a piece of his own heart, a photograph of someone he clearly loved and missed, to watch over a stranger. Dante's chest tightened. A sharp pain spread across his ribs, and for a moment he thought he might actually be having a heart attack. But it was not his heart failing. It was something breaking inside him, something that had been frozen solid for 20 years. A crack appeared in the stone wall he had built around himself, and, through that crack, a terrible truth began to seep in. He had been wrong. He had been wrong about everything. The boy shifted slightly in the corner, pulling his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders. The room was warm near the fire, but the corner where Matteo sat was farther away, colder. The boy shivered, but he did not complain. He did not ask for anything. He simply sat there, waiting for his mother to return, trying his best to be invisible. Dante wanted to open his eyes. He wanted to sit up and speak to the boy, to ask him why he had done what he did. But he could not. Not yet. His throat felt tight, and his eyes, still closed, were burning. He realized with shock that he was on the verge of tears. He could not remember the last time he had cried. It had been years. Decades, perhaps. He had cried when his wife Sophia died 5 years ago, but even then, the tears had been brief and private. He had not allowed himself to truly grieve. He had buried his pain beneath layers of bitterness and suspicion, and he had told himself that it was safer that way. Safer to trust no one. Safer to expect the worst from everyone. But this boy had shattered that safety. This boy, with his small hands and his careful movements and his grandmother's photograph, had reached into Dante's chest and pulled out something he thought was dead. Compassion. Innocence. Hope. Dante kept his eyes closed and his breathing steady, but inside, he was falling apart. Minutes passed. The fire continued to crackle. The rain continued to fall. The clock continued to tick. And in the corner of the room, a small boy sat quietly, waiting for his mother, unaware that he had just changed the life of one of the wealthiest and most cynical men in all of Venice. The silence in the study stretched on, thick and heavy. Dante remained motionless in his chair, his breathing still deep and rhythmic, though his mind was anything but calm. Through the narrow slit of his eyelids, he watched the boy in the corner. Matteo had not moved since returning to his spot on the Persian rug. He sat with his back pressed against the bookshelf, his knees drawn up to his chest, his arms wrapped tightly around his legs. The child looked so small, so fragile, like a bird that had fallen from its nest and did not know how to fly back up. Dante's neck was aching now, a dull throb that pulsed with every heartbeat. His left shoulder had gone stiff from holding the same position for so long. But he could not move. Not yet. He needed to understand what had just happened. He needed to make sense of the boy's actions, to fit them into the framework of the world he had constructed over the past 2 decades. But no matter how hard he tried, the pieces would not fit. The boy had been alone with 10,000 euros. No witnesses. No cameras. No one to stop him. And yet he had not taken a single bill. More than that, he had protected the money. He had secured it, treated it with care, as if it belonged to someone who mattered. As if Dante mattered. The medication bottles lined up on the desk caught the flickering light from the fireplace. They stood in perfect order, their labels facing forward, arranged by time of day. 8 in the morning. 12 noon. 4 in the afternoon. 8 at night. Before bed. It was exactly the way Sophia used to arrange them. Every morning for the last 3 years of her life, Sophia had sat at that very desk and organized Dante's pills. She would check each label twice, set them in a row, and place a glass of water beside them. She would not let him leave the study until he had taken the morning dose in front of her. "You are too stubborn for your own good," she used to say with a gentle smile. "If I do not watch you, you will forget, and then where will I be? Alone in this big house with no one to argue with." Dante had not thought about those mornings in years. He had buried the memory along with everything else that hurt too much to remember. But now, seeing those bottles arranged so carefully by a child's hands, the memory came flooding back with such force that it took his breath away. He could almost see Sophia sitting at the desk, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, her silver hair catching the morning light. He could almost hear her voice, soft and patient, reminding him to take his pills on time because she loved him and wanted him to stay alive. And now, in her place, there was a faded photograph of an old woman who looked remarkably like Sophia. A grandmother who had also taken heart medication. A grandmother who had taught her grandson the importance of remembering, of caring, of watching over those who could no longer watch over themselves. Dante's throat tightened. He swallowed hard, forcing down the lump that had formed there. He told himself that he was being foolish, that he was reading too much into a simple act of tidiness. The boy had probably just picked up the bottles because they were on the floor. It meant nothing. It was coincidence. But even as he thought these things, Dante knew they were lies. The boy had not simply picked up the bottles. He had read the labels. He had organized them. He had placed his grandmother's photograph beside them as a guardian, a protector. That was not coincidence. That was love. That was the kind of love that remembered. The kind of love that did not ask for anything in return. A soft sound broke the silence. It was so quiet that Dante almost missed it. A sniffle. Then another. Dante's eyes opened just a fraction wider, and he looked toward the corner where Matteo sat. The boy's shoulders were shaking slightly. His head was bent forward, his face hidden behind his knees. He was crying, but he was doing it silently, desperately trying not to make a sound. Matteo lifted one thin arm and wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his jacket. The fabric was already damp. He took a shaky breath, trying to steady himself, but another sob escaped, muffled against his knees. Then, so quietly that Dante could barely hear it, the boy began to speak. He was not speaking to anyone in particular. Perhaps he was speaking to himself, or perhaps to the photograph he had left on the desk, or perhaps to the sleeping man in the chair who he thought could not hear him. "Signore," Matteo whispered, his voice trembling. "I hope you are not too sick. You look like my Nonna Lucia did before she went to heaven. She was always cold, even in the summer. And she forgot things. She forgot where she put her glasses. She forgot what day it was. But she never forgot her medicine. Never. She said that was the most important thing." The boy paused, wiping his eyes again. "Everyone says I am a thief," he continued, his voice breaking. "But I am not. I did not take the watch. It was Lorenzo. He is the headmaster's son. He put it in my bag after the mathematics competition because I won first place and he came in third. He was angry. He said I cheated because poor people are not supposed to be smart. But I did not cheat. I studied every night with my mama. She helped me even though she was so tired from working." Matteo's voice cracked, and he buried his face in his knees for a moment, his small body shaking with silent sobs. When he spoke again, his words were barely audible. "Nobody believes me. The headmaster said I was lying because Lorenzo would never do such a thing. He said people like me always blame people like Lorenzo because we are jealous. But I am not jealous. I just wanted to tell the truth. I just wanted someone to believe me. Just once." Dante felt something inside his chest shatter. It was not a crack this time. It was a complete and total break, like a dam giving way under too much pressure. The boy's words cut through him like a blade, sharp and merciless. "People like me." The headmaster had said that to a 9-year-old child. He had reduced Matteo's entire existence to a category, a label, a judgment. Poor, unworthy, guilty by circumstance. And the world had believed it. The world had turned its back on this boy and called him a thief without evidence, without mercy, without a second thought. Dante knew that kind of judgment. He had seen it destroy a man once. 20 years ago, Dante's business partner, a man named Luca Rossellini, had been accused of embezzling funds from their shipping company. The accusation had come from Marco and Giulia, Dante's own children, who were in their 20s at the time and working in the company. They had presented documents, emails, transaction records. Everything pointed to Luca. The evidence was overwhelming. Dante had believed them. He had trusted his own blood over a man he had known for 30 years. He had turned Luca over to the authorities, testified against him in court, and watched as his former partner was sentenced to 8 years in prison. 2 years into Luca's sentence, Dante had discovered the truth by accident. He had been reviewing old company files, searching for something unrelated, when he found a hidden folder on Marco's computer. Inside were the original documents before they had been altered. Marco and Giulia had fabricated the entire case. They had forged emails, falsified transaction records, and framed Luca because he had refused to approve a risky investment scheme they wanted to pursue. Luca had stood in their way, so they had removed him. Dante had confronted his children, and they had shown no remorse. "Father," Marco had said with a cold smile, "this is business. You taught us to do whatever it takes to win. We won." Dante had tried to free Luca, to clear his name, to undo the damage. But it was too late. Luca had died in prison 6 months earlier from a heart attack. He had died alone, disgraced, abandoned by everyone who had once called him a friend. Dante had attended the funeral, but Luca's family had turned him away. They had spat at his feet and told him he was a murderer. And they were right. Dante had killed Luca as surely as if he had put a gun to the man's head. He had believed the worst without question. He had chosen greed and ambition over loyalty and truth. And a good man had paid the price. After that, Dante had cut off his children. He had removed them from the company, rewritten his will, and told them never to contact him again unless they were willing to confess publicly and face the consequences. They had refused. They had walked away without a backward glance, and Dante had not seen them since. That was when the bitterness had taken root. That was when Dante had begun testing people, setting traps, searching for proof that everyone was corrupt. If everyone was guilty, then he was not uniquely evil. If everyone was a thief, then his failure to believe in Luca was just realism, not betrayal. But now, sitting in his study, listening to a 9-year-old boy confess his pain to a man he thought was asleep, Dante realized the terrible truth. He had not been searching for proof of humanity's corruption. He had been searching for an excuse. An excuse to hate. An excuse to isolate. An excuse to never trust again, so he would never have to face the guilt of failing someone who trusted him. Matteo was still speaking, his voice so soft it was almost lost beneath the sound of the rain. "I wish my Nana was still here," the boy whispered. "She always believed me. When I told her something, she never said I was lying. She said I had an honest face. She said honest faces do not lie, even when the world wants them to. I miss her so much. I miss her every single day. Mama says Nana is in heaven now, watching over us. I hope that is true. I hope she can see me. I hope she knows I am trying to be good. I am trying so hard." The boy's voice dissolved into quiet sobs. He pressed his face against his knees and cried, his small body trembling with the effort of staying silent. Dante could not bear it any longer. The pain in his chest was too great, the weight of his guilt too crushing. He wanted to sit up, to go to the boy, to tell him that he believed him, that he was sorry, that the world was wrong. But he could not move. He was paralyzed by shame, by the realization of what he had become. He had turned into the headmaster. He had turned into the people who had condemned Luca without proof. He had become the very thing he hated most. The door to the study suddenly burst open, slamming against the wall with a loud bang that echoed through the room. Alessia rushed in, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. She had finished cleaning the ballroom early, and she had heard sounds coming from the study. Voices. Or perhaps just one voice. She had panicked, afraid that Matteo had disturbed the signore, afraid that everything was about to fall apart. She stopped just inside the doorway, her chest heaving, her gaze darting around the room. She saw Matteo sitting in the corner, his face red and streaked with tears. She saw the desk with the money stacked neatly, the marble paperweight holding it down. She saw the prescription bottles lined up in perfect order. And she saw the photograph. Her mother's photograph. The one Matteo carried everywhere, the one he slept with under his pillow, the one he had promised never to lose. Alessia's face crumpled. She understood immediately what had happened, or at least she thought she did. She thought Matteo had touched the signore's things. She thought he had moved the money, disturbed the desk, left his photograph behind as evidence of his presence. She thought they were finished. "Oh God," she breathed, her voice barely more than a gasp. "Matteo, what did you do?" She crossed the room in 3 quick steps and grabbed her son by the arm, pulling him roughly to his feet. Matteo let out a small cry of pain, but he did not resist. His eyes were red and swollen from crying, and he looked up at his mother with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Mama, I did not," he began, but Alessia cut him off. "Did you touch the signore's desk?" she demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "Did you touch his money?" Matteo shook his head frantically. "No, Mama. I did not take anything. I saw it was going to blow away, and Alessia was not listening." She turned toward the desk and saw the photograph leaning against the lamp. She let out a strangled sob and released Matteo's arm, stumbling toward the desk. She snatched up the photograph with shaking hands and stared at it as if it were a confession of guilt. "You left Nana's picture on his desk," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why would you do that? They will say you were stealing. They will say you were going through his things. Matteo, they already think you are a thief. Why did you give them more reasons?" "No, Mama," Matteo protested, tears streaming down his face. "I was not stealing. I was trying to help. The medicine was on the floor, and I do not care what you were trying to do," Alessia cried, her voice rising to a near shout. She clapped a hand over her mouth immediately, horrified that she had raised her voice in the presence of the sleeping signore. She turned toward Dante's chair, her eyes wide with dread. But Dante did not stir. He remained slumped in his chair, his breathing steady, his eyes closed. Alessia let out a shaky breath of relief, but her hands were still trembling. She turned back to Matteo and grabbed his shoulders, shaking him slightly. "We are going to leave right now," she said, her voice tight and controlled. "We are going to walk out of this house quietly, and we are never coming back. Do you understand?" But before Matteo could respond, a low, gravelly voice filled the room. "What is all this noise?" The voice was sharp and irritated, the voice of a man who had been rudely awakened from a deep sleep. Alessia froze. Her hands fell away from Matteo's shoulders, and she turned slowly toward the armchair. Dante Moretti was stirring. His eyes fluttered open, and he blinked several times, as if adjusting to the light. He looked around the room with a confused, disoriented expression. Then his gaze landed on Alessia and Matteo, and his face darkened. "What is going on here?" Dante demanded, his voice rough. "Why are you shouting in my study? Can a man not rest in his own home without being disturbed?" Alessia's face drained of all color. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her legs felt weak, and she thought she might collapse right there on the Persian rug. She tried to speak, tried to form words, but her throat had closed up with fear. "Signore," she finally managed to whisper. "I am so sorry. I did not mean to wake you. I was just—" Dante sat up in his chair, wincing as if his back pained him. He looked at the desk, at the money, at the bottles of medication. His expression was unreadable. "Who brought a child into my study?" he asked coldly. Alessia took a step back, pulling Matteo behind her as if to shield him from the old man's gaze. "It is my son, Signore," she said, her voice trembling. "I had no choice. The schools were closed, and I had nowhere to leave him. I begged Signora Fabbri for permission. I promised he would not be any trouble. I am so sorry. Please do not dismiss us. We have nowhere else to go." Dante's eyes shifted to Matteo. The boy was standing behind his mother, his small hands clutching the fabric of her uniform. His face was red and blotchy from crying, and his eyes were wide with fear. For a long moment, Dante said nothing. He simply stared at the child, his expression cold and hard. Then he stood, leaning heavily on the armrest of the chair. He reached for the cane that was propped against the side table and used it to steady himself as he rose to his full height. Even at 68, bent with age, Dante Moretti was an imposing figure. He took a step toward them, and Alessia instinctively moved backward, pulling Matteo with her. Dante pointed his cane toward the desk. That money, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Did the boy touch it? Alessia's breath caught in her throat. No, signore, she said quickly. I mean, he may have straightened it, but he did not take any. I swear on my life. He would never steal. And those, Dante continued, pointing now at the row of medication bottles. Did he touch those as well? Yes, signore, Alessia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But only because they were on the floor. He was trying to help. He did not mean any harm. Please, you have to believe me. Dante's jaw tightened. He looked at Matteo again, his gaze sharp and piercing. Boy, he said, his voice like iron. Come here. Matteo hesitated, his hands still gripping his mother's uniform. Alessia turned and knelt in front of him, gripping his shoulders. Do what he says, she whispered urgently. Do exactly what he says, and maybe he will not call the police. Matteo's eyes filled with fresh tears, but he nodded. He released his mother's uniform and took a small, hesitant step toward the old man. Then another. And another. He stopped a few feet away from Dante, his head bowed, his hands clasped in front of him. He looked like a prisoner awaiting sentencing. Dante stared down at the boy. Did you put your hands on my money? He asked. Yes, signore, Matteo whispered. Why? Because the wind was blowing it, and it was going to fall on the floor. I did not want it to get lost. Dante's expression did not change. And did you put your hands on my medication? Yes, signore. Why? Because they were on the floor, and the bottles say they are important. My nonna had the same kind of medicine. She said if you do not take them at the right times, your heart can stop. I did not want your heart to stop. Dante was silent for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, and the photograph. Did you leave that on my desk? Yes, signore. Why? Matteo looked up at Dante for the first time. His eyes were red and swollen, but there was no deception in them. Only honesty. Only pain. Because, Matteo said, his voice breaking, because my nonna used to watch over my medicine when I was sick. She never forgot. She was very good at remembering. And I thought maybe if I left her picture, she could watch over your medicine too. So you would not forget. So you would be safe. The room fell into complete silence. Even the fire seemed to have stopped crackling. The rain continued to hammer against the windows, but inside the study, everything was still. Dante stared at the boy, his face unreadable. Alessia was holding her breath, her hands pressed against her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. Matteo stood before the old man, small and vulnerable, waiting for judgment. Then Dante did something that neither of them expected. He turned away from them and walked slowly to his desk. He set his cane aside and picked up the photograph of Nonna Lucia. He held it carefully in both hands, studying the image of the old woman and the young boy. His hands were shaking. This is your grandmother, Dante said, his voice softer now. Yes, signore, Matteo replied. And she died? Yes, signore. 2 years ago. And you loved her very much? Yes, signore. More than anything. Dante set the photograph back down on the desk, his movements slow and deliberate. He turned to face them again, and for the first time, Alessia saw something in his eyes that she had not seen before. Not anger. Not coldness. Something else. Something that looked almost like sorrow. I have a confession to make, Dante said quietly. Alessia and Matteo exchanged a confused glance, but neither of them spoke. I was not asleep, Dante continued. He looked directly at Alessia. When you brought your son into this room, I was awake. I was pretending. Alessia's eyes widened. She felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her. You were pretending? She whispered. Yes, Dante said. The money on the desk. The medication bottles on the floor. I put them there on purpose. I wanted to see what your son would do. I wanted to test him. Alessia's face went from pale to red. Her expression shifted from fear to something else. Hurt. Betrayal. Anger. You were testing us? She said, her voice rising. Like we are animals in a cage? Dante did not flinch. Yes, he said simply. I have tested many people over the years. Staff members. Business associates. Even family. I test them because I believe that everyone is a thief. I believe that if you give a person the chance to take something without being caught, they will take it. Every single time. And what did you find? Alessia demanded, her voice shaking with fury. Did my son pass your test? Did he prove himself worthy to you? Dante looked at Matteo, who was standing very still, his face pale. Yes, Dante said quietly. He did. He did not take the money. He did not steal. Instead, he protected what was mine. He cared for my medication. He left something precious of his own to watch over me. He gave when I expected him to take. Alessia let out a bitter laugh. So we passed. How wonderful. Now we can leave with your approval. She grabbed Mateo's hand and turned toward the door. Wait, Dante said, his voice sharper now. Alessia stopped but did not turn around. I am not finished, Dante said. Alessia turned slowly, her eyes blazing. What more do you want from us? You have humiliated us. You have tested us like we are criminals. What more could you possibly want? Dante walked around the desk and stood in the center of the room. He leaned heavily on his cane, and for the first time, he looked his age. He looked tired. Broken. I want to apologize, he said. The words seemed to cost him great effort. Alessia stared at him, stunned. What? I want to apologize, Dante repeated. To you. And to your son. I had no right to test you. I had no right to treat you as if you were guilty before you ever had a chance to prove otherwise. I have spent 20 years punishing the world for my own mistakes, and I have become a cruel, bitter man because of it. Your son deserved better. You deserved better. Alessia did not know what to say. She had expected anger, dismissal, cruelty. She had not expected this. Signore, she said slowly, I do not understand. Dante looked at Matteo. You said that no one believes you, he said to the boy. You said that you were accused of stealing a watch, and no one believed you when you said you were innocent. Is that true? Matteo nodded, his eyes filling with tears again. Yes, signore. It was Lorenzo, the headmaster's son. He put the watch in my bag. But no one believed me because people like you do not lie, and people like me do. Dante's face hardened, but not with anger at Matteo. With anger at the people who had judged him. I believe you, Dante said. Matteo looked up, his eyes wide with shock. You do? Yes, Dante said. I believe you. And I am going to prove it. Dante walked to his desk and picked up the telephone. He dialed a number from memory, and after a moment, someone answered on the other end. This is Dante Moretti, he said into the receiver. I need to speak with Chief Inspector Ricci immediately. It is urgent. There was a pause. Alessia and Matteo stood frozen, watching him. Yes, I will hold, Dante said. He looked at Alessia while he waited. You said your son was expelled from San Marco Academy, correct? Yes, signore, Alessia said, her voice barely audible. 2 weeks ago. And the headmaster said there was no evidence to support your son's claim that he was framed. No, signore. He said the matter was closed. Dante's expression was grim. We will see about that. The person on the other end of the line came back and Dante straightened. Inspector Ricci, he said, his voice commanding. I need your assistance with a matter involving San Marco Academy. A boy was falsely accused of theft, and I want a full investigation opened immediately. Alessia's hands flew to her mouth. She could not believe what she was hearing. Yes, Dante continued. The boy's name is Matteo Cavalli. He was accused of stealing a gold watch belonging to a teacher. However, I have reason to believe the accusation was fabricated by another student, Lorenzo Benedetti, the son of the headmaster. I want security footage reviewed. I want witness statements taken. And I want it done within 48 hours. He paused, listening. Yes, I am aware that the case was closed. I do not care. Reopen it. I will personally fund the investigation. I will also provide legal representation for the Cavalli family if necessary. Alessia sank to her knees, her legs giving out beneath her. She covered her face with her hands and began to sob. Matteo ran to her and wrapped his small arms around her, burying his face in her shoulder. Good, Dante said into the phone. I expect a report by Friday. And Inspector, one more thing. If you find that the headmaster was complicit in covering up his son's actions, I want him held accountable. Fully accountable. I do not care who he knows or how much influence he has. Justice is not negotiable. Dante hung up the phone and turned to face them. Alessia was still on her knees, clinging to her son, her body shaking with sobs. Matteo was crying too, but he was smiling through his tears. Signore, Alessia choked out. Why would you do this for us? Dante walked slowly toward them and stopped a few feet away. He looked down at them, and his expression was softer now. Gentler. Because 20 years ago, I failed to believe in someone who was innocent, he said quietly. A man named Luca Rossellini. He was my business partner and my friend. My children accused him of embezzlement, and I believed them without question. I sent him to prison. 2 years later, I discovered that my children had lied. They had framed him. But by then, Luca was dead. He died in prison, alone and disgraced, and I never had the chance to tell him I was sorry. Dante's voice broke, and he paused to compose himself. I have spent 20 years living with that guilt, he continued. I have spent 20 years telling myself that everyone is corrupt, that trust is foolish, that the world is full of thieves and liars. I used that belief to justify my own cruelty. But your son proved me wrong. He showed me that there are still people in this world who care. People who give instead of take. People who protect instead of destroy. I cannot bring Luca back. I cannot undo the harm I caused. But I can make sure that what happened to him does not happen to your son. I can make sure that Matteo is believed. That he is vindicated. That the world knows he is innocent. Alessia looked up at Dante, her face wet with tears. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you, signore. Thank you. Dante shook his head. Do not thank me, he said. I am simply trying to be less of a monster than I have been. He looked at Matteo. You have a gift, boy. The world tried to take it from you. It tried to make you bitter and angry and afraid. But it failed. You are still kind. You are still honest. You are still good. Do not ever let them take that from you. Do you understand? Matteo nodded, his eyes wide and serious. Yes, signore. I understand. Good, Dante said. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out the envelope of money from the desk. He held it out to Alessia. Take this, he said. Alessia shook her head immediately. No, signore. I cannot. I did not earn it. It is not charity, Dante said firmly. It is payment. Payment for the lesson your son taught me today. Payment for reminding me what it means to be human. Take it. Buy your son a warm coat. Buy him new shoes. Buy yourself a proper bed. You have earned it 1,000 times over. Alessia hesitated, then slowly reached out and took the envelope. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. Thank you, she whispered again. Dante nodded. There is one more thing, he said. Alessia looked up at him confused. From now on, I want you and your son to come here every day after his school is resolved. Not as my maid and her child. As my guests. Matteo can do his homework in the library. You can manage my charitable foundation. I need someone I can trust, and I believe I have found that person. Alessia's eyes filled with fresh tears. Signore, I do not know what to say. Then say nothing, Dante replied. Just accept. Alessia stood, pulling Matteo up with her. She looked at the old man, this wealthy, powerful figure who had seemed so cold and cruel, and she saw something different now. She saw a man who had been broken and was trying to put himself back together. She saw a man who had lost his way and was searching for redemption. Thank you, signore, she said softly. We accept. Dante allowed himself a small smile. It was the first genuine smile he had worn in years. Good, he said. Then it is settled. He turned and walked back to his desk. He picked up the photograph of Nonna Lucia and held it for a moment, studying the face of the old woman who had taught her grandson to care for others. Then he set it back down, placing it carefully beside the row of medication bottles. She will watch over me, he said quietly. Just as your son promised. And perhaps, with her help, I will remember how to be the man I used to be. Before I forgot what it meant to trust. 7 years passed. The rain that had hammered against the windows of Dante Moretti's study on that cold October afternoon was long gone, replaced now by the warm golden light of a summer evening. The mansion, once silent and empty, was filled with the sounds of life. Laughter echoed through the hallways. Music played softly in the drawing room. The gardens, which had been overgrown and neglected for so many years, were now bursting with color. Roses climbed the stone walls, and lavender lined the pathways. Inside, the study looked much the same as it had 7 years ago, but there were small differences. The bookshelves were fuller now, packed with medical textbooks and anatomy charts. A large oak desk had been added near the window, covered with papers and notebooks. And on the mantel above the fireplace, in a place of honor, sat a small framed photograph of an elderly woman holding a young boy on her lap. Nonna Lucia. Dante Moretti sat in his armchair, but he was not pretending to sleep this time. He was truly resting, his body tired and worn. He was 75 years old now, and the years had not been kind to him. His heart, which had been failing slowly for the past decade, was finally giving out. The doctors had told him he had weeks left. Maybe days. But Dante was not afraid. He had made his peace. He had spent the last 7 years trying to undo the damage he had caused, trying to be the man Sophia would have wanted him to be. And he had succeeded, at least in part. He had cleared Matteo's name. The investigation he had funded revealed that Lorenzo Benedetti had indeed stolen the watch and planted it in Matteo's bag. Security footage confirmed it. The headmaster, desperate to protect his son, had destroyed evidence and intimidated witnesses. Both Lorenzo and his father faced criminal charges. The headmaster was removed from his position, and Matteo's record was expunged completely. Dante had enrolled Matteo in one of the finest private academies in Venice, paying for his tuition, his books, his uniforms. Everything. And Matteo had thrived. He was a brilliant student, particularly gifted in the sciences. By the time he was 16, he had already decided he wanted to become a doctor. Not for the money or the prestige, but because he wanted to help people the way his Nonna Lucia had helped him. Dante had been so proud. He had funded Matteo's education without hesitation, setting aside a trust that would cover medical school, residency, everything the boy would need to achieve his dream. Alessia had also flourished. Dante had given her a position managing his charitable foundation, and she had proven to be exceptional at it. Under her leadership, the foundation had expanded, funding scholarships for underprivileged children, legal defense for the falsely accused, and medical care for those who could not afford it. Alessia was no longer the tired, desperate woman who had walked into Dante's study 7 years ago. She was confident, respected, and deeply loved by everyone who knew her. But more than all of that, Alessia and Matteo had become Dante's family. They visited him every day. They ate dinner with him. They celebrated holidays together. Matteo called him nonno, grandfather, and Dante's heart swelled every time he heard it. For the first time in 20 years, Dante was not alone. The door to the study opened and Matteo walked in. He was 16 now, tall and lean, with his mother's dark eyes and a quiet confidence that came from knowing he was loved. He wore a simple shirt and jeans, and he carried a small tray with a glass of water and a row of pill bottles. Evening medication, nonno, Matteo said with a smile. Right on time. Dante chuckled softly. You were as diligent as your nana was, he said. She would be proud of you. Matteo set the tray down on the side table and began opening the bottles one by one. He handed Dante each pill in the correct order, watching carefully to make sure the old man took them. You say that every day, Matteo said. Because it is true every day, Dante replied. He swallowed the last pill and drank the rest of the water. Thank you, my boy. Matteo smiled and sat down on the floor beside Dante's chair, just as he had done 7 years ago. Except now he was not afraid. He was home. How are you feeling today? Matteo asked. Tired, Dante admitted. But happy. That is all that matters. Matteo nodded. He reached up and adjusted the photograph of Nonna Lucia on the mantel, making sure it was perfectly straight. She is still watching over you, he said softly. Yes, Dante said. She is. And so are you. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the house. Alessia was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. Music drifted in from somewhere down the hall. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. No, Matteo said after a while. Yes? Do you ever regret it? Regret what? Matteo hesitated, then said, believing in me. Taking a chance on us. Giving us all of this. Dante looked down at the boy, his expression gentle. Not for a single moment, he said. You saved my life, Matteo. Not just physically, but in every way that matters. You reminded me what it means to be human. You gave me a family. You gave me a reason to live. If anything, I should be asking if you regret giving me a second chance. Matteo shook his head quickly. Never, he said. You believed in me when no one else did. You gave my mama and me a future. We will never forget that. Dante reached down and placed a hand on Matteo's shoulder. You have a good heart, boy, he said. The world tried to break it, but it could not. Never let it. Promise me. I promise, Matteo said. Dante smiled. Good. Then I can rest easy. 2 days later, Dante Moretti passed away peacefully in his sleep. He died in the armchair where he had once pretended to test the world, surrounded by the people who loved him. Alessia and Matteo were at his side. They held his hands. They whispered their goodbyes. And they thanked him for everything he had given them. A week after his death, Dante's will was read in the grand library of the mansion. The room was filled with people. Lawyers, business associates, distant relatives. And sitting in the front row were Marco and Giulia, Dante's biological children. They had not visited their father in 7 years. They had not called. They had not written. But now, with news of his death, they had appeared immediately, dressed in expensive black suits, their faces carefully arranged into expressions of grief that did not reach their eyes. They sat with their arms crossed, waiting impatiently for the reading to begin. The lawyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, stood at the front of the room and cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "I will now read the last will and testament of Dante Moretti." He opened a leather folder and began to read. "To my children, Marco and Giulia Moretti. You abandoned me years ago. You framed an innocent man and destroyed his life. You showed no remorse. You came to me only when you wanted money, and you disappeared when I had nothing left to give you. Therefore, I leave you nothing. The trust funds that were established for you at birth remain intact, and you may access them. But you will receive no additional inheritance from me. You have already taken enough." Marco and Giulia sat frozen in their seats, their faces pale. Around them, people whispered and exchanged shocked glances. The lawyer continued. "To the rest of my estate, including this mansion, my companies, my investments, and my personal savings, I leave everything to Matteo Cavalli." Matteo, who was sitting beside his mother in the second row, gasped. He turned to Alessia, his eyes wide with disbelief. She was crying, her hands covering her mouth. The lawyer continued reading. "Matteo, you gave me something I thought I had lost forever. You gave me trust. You gave me kindness. You gave me hope. You reminded me that the poorest pocket can hold the richest heart. I am giving you my fortune not because you need it, but because I know you will use it wisely. You will help people the way you helped me. You will be the man I should have been all along. Use this gift to change the world. I know you will." The room erupted in noise. Marco stood abruptly, his face red with fury. "This is insane," he shouted. "That boy is nothing. He is a stranger. We are his children. This will is invalid." The lawyer looked at Marco with cold disdain. "The will is entirely valid," he said. "It was reviewed by 3 independent legal experts. Your father was of sound mind when he wrote it. You may contest it if you wish, but I assure you, you will lose." Giulia stood as well, her voice shaking with rage. "He manipulated our father," she spat, pointing at Matteo. "He tricked him into giving him everything." "Matteo did no such thing," Alessia said, standing to face them. Her voice was calm but firm. "Matteo gave your father something you never did. He gave him love. He gave him respect. He gave him a reason to live. You gave him nothing but pain." Marco and Giulia glared at her, but they had no response. They stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind them. The room fell silent. The lawyer looked at Matteo. "There is one more thing," he said. "Your grandfather, Dante, left a letter for you. He wanted me to give it to you personally." The lawyer reached into the folder and pulled out a sealed envelope. He handed it to Matteo. Matteo took it with trembling hands. He opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the letter inside. It was written in Dante's shaky handwriting. He began to read aloud, his voice breaking. "My dear Matteo, if you are reading this, then I am gone. I hope I left this world peacefully, surrounded by the family I chose. You and your mother gave me 7 years of happiness that I did not deserve. You took a bitter, broken old man and taught him how to love again. I leave you my fortune, but I do not expect you to keep it for yourself. I know you, Matteo. I know your heart. You will use this money to help others, just as you helped me. You will build schools. You will fund hospitals. You will defend the innocent. You will be the light in the darkness. That is who you are. Never forget the boy who placed his grandmother's photograph on my desk. Never forget the boy who cared for a stranger because it was the right thing to do. The world needs more people like you. Be that person. Always. With all my love. Your nonno, Dante." Matteo folded the letter carefully and held it against his chest. Tears streamed down his face, but he was smiling. "Thank you, nonno," he whispered. "I will make you proud." Alessia wrapped her arms around her son and held him tightly. Around them, people began to leave quietly, offering their condolences and congratulations. But Matteo and Alessia stayed in the library for a long time, sitting together in the place where their lives had changed forever. On the mantel above the fireplace, Nonna Lucia's photograph watched over them, her kind eyes smiling down. And in the corner of the room, if you looked closely, you could almost see the faint outline of a small boy sitting on a rug, waiting patiently for his mother, his heart full of hope. Matteo grew up to be a doctor, just as he had dreamed. He specialized in cardiology, the study of the heart. He opened free clinics in poor neighborhoods, treating patients who could not afford care. He funded scholarships for children like himself, children who had been judged and dismissed by the world. And every time someone asked him why he gave so much, why he worked so hard, Matteo would smile and say, "Because someone once believed in me when no one else would." And that belief changed everything. Kindness is not a weakness. It is a strength. It is a choice. And it is the only thing that can truly change the world.